You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 9th of February 2026 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, we'll wrap a big week in Asia, elections in Japan and Thailand, and the sentencing of Hong Kong media tycoon Jimmy Lai, with Richard Lloyd Parry on the ground in Hong Kong. That's coming up in just a moment. After that... Asia wasn't the only continent holding elections. That sound is from Portugal, where the centre-left held its ground against the populist right in a presidential runoff. Our own Carlotta Rebello will join us to talk the results. We'll get the latest business headlines as well, and then...
You have to coordinate a very complex group of people, which they don't rehearse ever. You just see them on the day.
The challenge of managing a live event. We'll hear from the creative lead of the Milan Cortina opening ceremony as we kick off 2 weeks of coverage from the Winter Olympics. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Very happy Monday to all of our listeners. Hope you all had a great weekend. It has been a weekend of contrasts in East Asia, where we're going to be starting major democratic exercises underway in Japan and Thailand. And yet dominating the news today is word that the pro-democracy media tycoon Jimmy Lai has been sentenced to 20 years in prison by a Hong Kong court. The largest sentence handed down since Hong Kong enacted its now infamous national security law. Well, to discuss what all of this means, I'm joined from Hong Kong by Richard Lloyd Parry, Asia editor at The Times. Richard, you are normally in Tokyo. You have decamped to Hong Kong, even with the Japan elections going on. I suppose at the moment, as an Asia editor, you were spoiled for choice this weekend.
Yeah, spoiled for choice, or rather stretched. Yes, I mean, I covered the campaign in Japan last week, but Sunday morning, as voting was beginning in the snow in Tokyo, I had to hop over to Hong Kong for the sentencing this morning.
It is such big news. Tell us about it, what the mood is like in Hong Kong since you got there. I suppose another time in Hong Kong's history, we might have imagined massive protests, but what's the mood there today?
No, there are certainly no protests at all. At one moment, after Jimmy Lai's 20-year sentence had been announced, a man inside the courtroom gave a sudden shout. I assume that he was a sympathizer of Jimmy Lai who was registering some kind of protest. He was immediately descended on by several security guards and bustled out. So Hong Kong has changed profoundly since the big demonstrations in 2019 that were one of the things that have precipitated Jimmy Lai's downfall. And the answer to your question is that the mood in court this morning was somber and really quite grim. After the hearing, and it only went on for 7 minutes, I mean, the judges really just read out the names of the defendants and their sentences. But afterwards, there was sobbing, there was crying among relatives, wives, and other relatives of the men and one woman who had just been sentenced. So a very grim atmosphere, I'd say.
A grim atmosphere that was nonetheless expected. Is that fair to say, Richard, given the situation in Hong Kong at the moment? I mean, how was this 20-year prison sentence justified, frankly?
Well, that is the sentencing tariff for the crimes of which Jimmy Lai had been convicted, which are of collusion with foreign powers and sedition under the national security law. He could have got a life sentence. So perhaps from the point of view of Beijing, this looks like leniency. But for a man of 78 in poor health, the difference between a formal life sentence and a 20-year sentence is probably no more than theoretical.
And how will this be seen internationally? Is this something, I mean, it's obviously in the media headlines, but, I mean, will governments react at this point? Have governments reacted? This has been obviously something that has shifted over time now in Hong Kong. So in that sense, it's not a surprise. But the UK in particular, of course, who you're covering this for, how are they likely to react?
Well, the reactions are ongoing. The British government has made it clear for a while that it thinks Jimmy Lai should be freed. However, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, of course, visited Beijing and shook hands with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping just the other week. There was a lot of debate before and during that visit about whether it was right for him to go. And one of the arguments that was made against his going was that the Chinese authorities, or the Hong Kong authorities, are holding a British citizen, as Jimmy Lai is, essentially as a political prisoner. And to go and shake hands with Xi Jinping at this time was not appropriate. Now, Keir Starmer argued very vigorously that that's not the case, that we need to have dialogue with and lines of communication open with China, among other reasons, over matters like human rights. And he said that he had respectfully raised Jimmy Lai's case and other human rights cases with the Chinese. Whatever he said or however he said it, it doesn't seem to have made any practical difference to the sentence he received today.
Well, certainly not. And just as well, finally, to get your take, Richard, back in where you are, where you live in Japan, what is your sense of the elections there? This is obviously a contrast in terms of stories that we have on the one hand, Jimmy Lai, and on the other hand, the democratic exercise in Japan. What do you make of the rise of Takaichi?
Yeah, Japan's a very different country, a vigorous democracy, and this was a very vigorous election. Sanai Takaichi has won a landslide. Now, I was out following her campaign last week in Japan, and all the polls and also the people we spoke to indicated that she was going to win and win big. But I don't think anyone, even her, expected the win to be this big. She's got, I think, the largest majority of any post-war election in Japan. The Liberal Democratic Party went into the election with a minority in the House, and they've now got 2/3. So it's a huge win for Sanai Takaichi, and the question is what she will do with that majority and whether she will use it to advance what on paper is a very conservative nationalist political agenda.
Absolutely, and we will have more on Japan. You can also check out The Globalist from earlier on this morning for coverage of Japan. But Richard Lloyd-Parry, Asia editor at The Times, thanks very much for joining us from Hong Kong. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Sweden has announced it's tightening citizenship rules and raising the wait from 5 to 8 years. Applicants must also meet a minimum wage threshold and pass a Swedish language and society test. The new rules are expected to come into force in June. Germany has indicted a Ukrainian national over allegations of a plot linked to Russian intelligence to detonate parcel bombs in Europe. Prosecutors say the suspect and 2 others sent packages with trackers to investigate logistics routes for future attacks. European governments have accused Russia of sabotage across the continent since the Ukrainian war, which Moscow denies. Spanish train drivers have begun a 3-day strike disrupting hundreds of services nationwide. Unions say the walkout is to demand better safety and working conditions. The strike follows 2 deadly train crashes in January, one of which killed more than 40 people. And Cuba has warned international airlines they can no longer refuel in Havana as the country runs short of aviation fuel. The shortage follows a threat by U.S. President Donald Trump to punish countries that supply oil to Cuba. Flights may be cut or rerouted in the coming weeks. Those are the day's headlines here in Zurich. Chris, back to you at Midori House.
Thanks very much, Laura. In Zurich, well, to Portugal now, which held a second round of presidential elections over the weekend that, as in so many nations these days, was billed largely as a battle of pro-democracy establishment forces against the populist far right. In the end, it was the center-left socialist candidate, Antonio José Seguro, claiming a convincing victory with 2/3 of the vote. Well, Carlota Rebelo is Monocle's senior foreign correspondent and resident Portuguese expert, Portuguese citizen, joining me right here in the studio. Good to have you, Carlota.
Hi, Chris.
So maybe to step back, first of all, because this is always complicated, I feel, in democracies. What is the role of the president in Portugal to give us a sense of like what was at stake here?
Yes, so the president tends to be more of a symbolic figure, but it has two crucial powers, which is the power of vetoing laws that are proposed and voted in Parliament, and the power to dissolve Parliament, which at a time that is so contentious, that is when this all comes into force, and that those two powers should be highlighted. But generally speaking, the Portuguese president is more of a statesman, a figure that shows the diplomatic role of Portugal abroad, a soft power vehicle, let's call it. But those two powers are quite crucial. And at a time, as you indicated there, of a fracture and a rise of the far right, there's a extra attention at who would hold the power to dissolve Parliament just because.
Very similar in that sense to the powers of my home country of Austria. But in any case, to get to this election, also before we get to the results, we have to talk about the election itself, because that was in doubt whether it would even be held due to flooding.
Yes, so Portugal over the past week and a bit, nearly 2 weeks now, has had a successive amount of storms, one after the other, which have mostly impacted the centre and the northwest of the country. Cities and regions like Leiria have been completely submerged, and so far I believe the death toll is on 15 people, including some of the firefighters who are helping with the rescue. And now, because it has affected a very specific part of the country, there were debates whether or not the election should go ahead. Obviously, a detailed look at electoral law and what it says. And ultimately, only 8 municipalities did not vote in yesterday's election. They represent roughly 0.80% of the total votes, I believe, which is why, according to electoral law, it could go ahead because of course, everyone's vote matters, but in an election where the vote wasn't close, it's not enough for that to change the results. But we saw extraordinary scenes yesterday in one city, a town or village in the district of Coimbra. Some of the equivalent of the Marines of the Portuguese Navy and the Fuzileiros were getting people in and out of this area by using a sort of like rubber speedboat. The village itself was not submerged, was affected by the water, but not submerged, but the access to the village was. So that just paints the picture of the scale of the tragedy that has been happening in Portugal over the past week and a half.
The scale of the tragedy and just an extraordinary election to be holding in this moment. And I understand, Carlotta, as well, that even despite that, the turnout was very high. It was not record turnout, but this was also maybe because of the framing. This was the first runoff since the 1980s, that there was a record number of votes for the winner.
Absolutely. So the turnout was just slightly over 50%, which is not unusual for Portuguese elections in general. When I say elections, I'm not talking just presidential, but also legislative and municipal, local elections. But it is quite a good turnout, particularly when you take into consideration everything I've just explained. And because of this backdrop of this vote being seen as a fight between democratic values and the far right, you had something that I can't remember in recent history. You had leading voices of the social democratic right appealing to a vote on a socialist left-leaning candidate, precisely saying this so-called right-wing candidate does not represent us. That's far right, has nothing to do with the democratic right. And having that, including former presidents and former prime ministers who were elected by the Social Democrats, so the centre right, appealing for a vote on a socialist was quite a powerful thing. And you mentioned that there. This was the first time that Portugal had a second round of the presidential election since 1986. And back then, it was also a historic vote. And, for a lot of people, this election was the first time ever that they voted in a second round, because it has never really happened. And yes, while the turnout is not a record-breaking turnout, no single candidate in the history of Portugal's democracy since the revolution, so since 1974, no single candidate has received this amount of votes. So António José Seguro broke that record, and I think it was this gravitational pull of defending the values of that revolution, defending the democracy in Portugal and the rule of law as we know it, that brought people from all across the aisle, from both sides of the political spectrum.
Nonetheless, Carlota, as you said at the outset, given the powers of the president in Portugal, yes, defending the rule of law, but in bit more of a symbolic way, perhaps, because you do have the Prime Minister, the Parliament being the real centres of power. So how does this impact governing in Portugal? Does it impact it? Will this clip the wings of the far right in Parliament? Will it humble them? Chega is basically the main opposition force in Parliament.
Yes, Chega is the main opposition force. And I think more than anything, it's not about what it means for Chega, but what it means for the current Prime Minister, Luís Montenegro, and the Social Democrats. This is a bit of a wake-up call to them. You know, the fact that 33.18% of the vote went to a far-right party and the traditional right, let's call it, was not present in the second round is a bit scary. And as you said, Chega is the main opposition force. Despite this loss, they're going emboldened, and André Ventura is going back into Parliament as the leader of that party, emboldened by this vote. And he may not have won, but 33.18% in a dispute that's between, as he put it, between left and right. What does that? He basically, in his concession speech, he flipped the script saying, this is a victory for us because it shows we are the voice of the right. And I think that's where the next existential crisis for politics in Portugal is happening now, is actually who represents the right in Portugal. Is it the far right, or is it all these other parties on the right that need to unite somehow? And while we're speaking about André Ventura, there were just a few places where he won, and one of them was the vote of immigration, which, you know, as myself, an immigrant who voted here at the Portuguese consulate, you know, it's striking to see that. But then once you break down which regions and which nations overwhelmingly voted for him, it was clear that it's the places where there's a more traditional, let's call it, Portuguese immigration. So countries like France, which represents 25% of all total immigrant votes in Portugal, Luxembourg. So we're talking about historic immigration, people who moved in the 60s and 70s, the last few years of the dictatorship, in the wake of the end of the dictatorship. And when you talk about more recent immigration, like in the UK, where António José Seguro won, that's not the case. So even that is quite interesting because it shows the tale of two countries, and that's precisely the conversation that needs to start happening now. António José Seguro is meeting this afternoon with the still president and Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, and I think the start of the conversation now is how do you unite a country that is clearly on two tracks?
Carlota Rebelo, Monocle's senior foreign correspondent, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak, and it's time now to get the latest business headlines with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Ewan, good to have you back on for another week. We've got some analysis on recent tech sell-offs, which we've been talking about a lot over the last couple of weeks and months, frankly. But before we get to that, let's talk about the elections. We've been talking about different elections at the top of this show, but particularly the Japanese election result is causing quite a market reaction.
Hello, Chris. Yeah, Japanese stocks surging to fresh record highs today after that thumping election win for the LDP. And on the same news, bonds slumping today. Now, overall, the Nikkei 225 closed up 3.9%. The fifth session has now finished in Japan. It's fair to say that the Prime Minister takes a dovish stance on both fiscal and monetary policy, promising tax cuts and an increase, particularly in security spending. So that's boosted stocks in the defence sector. But broadly, she's being seen as expansionary when it comes to the economy. So that is good for companies, but it's not so good for bondholders. So some quite interesting moves in the Japanese market today.
Well, absolutely. And then beyond that, to get into some of the tech stuff that's been happening as well, you've been digging into the numbers behind last week's roller coaster for tech shares.
Yeah, that enormous sell-off we saw in tech stocks, though, should be said, on Friday, we saw a big rebound as well. But particularly in the software sector, a lot of concern that profitable software companies, for instance, accountancy services, are going to see their business eaten by cheaper and clever AI bots. But the wider and the bigger concern is the AI investments being laid out by the big tech companies, and that perhaps they are just too big. Now, fascinating, this number. Between just four of these tech giants, Amazon, Microsoft, Google parent company Alphabet, and Instagram owner Meta, incidentally, four of the six most valuable companies on the planet. Well, just those four companies are planning to spend about $650 billion this year on their AI investments. And that is near enough the same as they spent over the past 3 years combined. So a huge ramp up in spending. And to give that number a bit of context, that is more than the entire German federal government's budget for 2026. This is a lot of money. And finding historical comparisons means going back at least as far as the telecoms bubble of the 1990s, and perhaps back to the build out of the US railroad networks in the 19th century. So in short, this is a huge amount of money. And it's all a signal that none of these companies are prepared to lose the AI race. And building these cutting edge software models is an extraordinarily expensive process that requires stringing together thousands of chips that sell for tens of thousands of dollars a piece. And all that cash is going out of the front door, and it is causing quite a lot of worry for investors.
Worry and just watching it extremely closely. And also on the tech front, there's sort of we're picking winners and losers at this stage, aren't we? Also in investment. And there's a warning related to that about what AI could mean for financial analysis itself.
Yeah, one of the triggers last week was the release of not one but two clever plugins from AI firm Anthropic. At the beginning of the week, we had their open source legal plugin, and that was causing lots of concern that a lot of law firms are going to lose lots of their business. And then towards the end of the week was a new AI widget that's designed to carry out financial research. Now, the company says it can scrutinize company data and regulatory filings and come up with detailed financial analysis in minutes, which would have normally have taken a person days to complete. So it's all clever stuff. It's all potentially very useful. But Bloomberg opinion writer Palmy Olsen's been writing today about some of the problems around all of this. She points out that ChatGPT, which is now used by 10% of the global population each week, is already making human communication far more formulaic, as more and more of us use it to write LinkedIn posts and job applications and marketing material. We're all starting to sound a bit like ChatGPT. And she says that if and when one financial model becomes the obvious choice for complex financial research, an increasing number of firms are going to find their strategies resembling each other more and more. And the danger of that is that the problem of herd mentality in financial markets, which is already pretty bad, could be about to get an awful lot worse.
Well, absolutely. Just to follow up quickly on that, Ewan, I mean, the fact that you had things like fat fingers and the way that sort of computers take over, and sometimes you see these massive shocks in stock markets. I mean, will this add to that as well? I mean, is it just going to be computers talking to computers deciding which stocks go up, which stocks go down in future?
Well, I think that's the danger, because there's already an enormous amount of trading which is done by algorithms. So a lot of the most rapid trading is not done by humans anyway. So computers are programmed to pick up, for instance, headlines on the Bloomberg terminal when the jobs data comes out. That will flash across and somebody will read it, and that takes a couple of seconds. But the computer will already make that trade. So if a particularly bad job number comes in from the US, and they will make trades on the US dollar or on stocks. So that's already automated. So you can imagine if you're then going to plug in some AI models which are going to read, for instance, I don't know, an earnings release from Microsoft and come to a conclusion within seconds that these are not good numbers. So you can see that's going to kind of speed up the whole process. And you can almost see a world when humans are sort of taken out of this. And if the computers are all following the same models, and some of these AI models are not quite as clever as they seem, and they do just follow a lot of historical precedent, and if they're all saying the same thing, you can see this really amplifying some of the volatility that we already see in markets. So it'll be really interesting to keep an eye on how these developments shape the markets as we go forward.
Absolutely a discussion that will continue in the financial world, I'm sure. Ewan Potts, business reporter for Bloomberg, thank you very much for joining us today. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Well, finally, on today's show, the Winter Olympics have been underway since Friday's opening ceremony in Milan. Monocle is there on the ground throughout these next 2 weeks, broadcasting from the Allianz Winter Sky Lounge with a special show called Monocle in Milan. And earlier on the first edition of that show, we heard from Marco Balic. He's creative lead of the Milan Cortina opening ceremony and head of Balic Wonder Studio Milan. He's worked on numerous international shows and events, including Rio de Janeiro's closing ceremony in 2016 and the Turin opener in 2006. Our host of Monocle in Milan is Ed Stalker, and he started by asking Marco how the ceremony went for him.
In a way, it's the same process to create a great feature film, no? It's a same process. And the difference is that when you do a feature film, then like Avatar, then it stays. When we do this, then it's gone. So you're really focused to create at least 3 or 4 very powerful images that stays in the sort of the heart of people. And it's not just to involve the people from an aesthetic point of view. It's like using meaningful acts that delivered in a very spectacular way. This is the secret to create something that then goes inside of you, and that's what we are asked to do.
And you, of course, did something special this year in the sense that you also designed with your team the cauldron for the opening ceremony. I mean, tell us a little bit about that process.
Okay, the process from a personal point is that I've been involved in 16 between opening and closing, and personally I creative directed Rio Olympics opening and closing, and Torino opening and closing, and Sochi the 2 Paralympics. So for me, every time I saw cauldron, I always wanted to do something that I knew was, and if I have to say from a design point of view, I think that we brought in an experiential sort of factor to this object. It's not just a beautiful object. Heather, we did a magnificent cauldron in London, but then it stayed there. So what I think is new here is that this cauldron gives at the top of the hour, a small show with music and lights, and in a way, it adds to the experience of just watching the sacred flame of Olympia.
How is it, you've got to, this was a very interesting and difficult opening ceremony in the sense that it wasn't just the San Siro, which we can see over from this building over there. He's pointing over there. I was pointing in entirely the wrong direction. It's not just the San Siro opening stadium. You were in different locations. You had to choreograph that. You had video linking. The timing had to be perfect. That sounds, when we first met, you were sort of studying a list of athletes, all in different geographies, trying to work out who is where and who's going to hold the flag. That sounds probably why you might be quite exhausted.
I think the innovative factor of these Olympics was this widespread concept, which requires it's very beautiful for the athletes, so they all can participate to the athlete parade because they do the parade in their own competing location. From us creative, it's a nightmare because you have to coordinate a very complex group of people, which they don't rehearse ever. You just see them on the day. And so you have to rely on really good stage management and protocol key people. And in this case, Lida Castelli did an amazing job, both from the protocol in the stadium and coordinating the athlete parade. And overall, I think we won, meaning that the athlete parade, which at the end it's very long usually, and halfway through, when you arrive at the letter H or something, you start to go up and then drink a coffee or something. In this case, the fact that it was in 4 different locations, it gives a different vibe to it, and the athletes were thrilled, and so I'm really, really happy of what happened. And for us creative, I think also to keep the emotion up within the 4 locations. In San Siro, when you watch a video, it's not the same as you have an act in front of your eyes. So That, I think, was a big concern for us, and I hope we managed to fulfill the expectation.
I think you did indeed. I mean, that's a tough thing, right? Because, and you also said this when we first talked, you have to balance the fact that you're having to appeal to the people who are watching it live in a stadium, the crowd, and then you have people all over the world. So you sort of have to balance two shows within one in a way. Plus, you have to be universal enough to appeal to everyone from every corner of the world. Is that easier than it sounds or harder than it sounds?
Well, it's a good question, because to do an event that has meaning, you have to create the energy in that place where it happened. And then that transfer through broadcast the rest of the world. If you don't feel the energy there, it doesn't go through. In this case, the energy has to split in 4 locations. So that was kind of the challenge. But I think that we worked a lot on that. And I think we created enough. For example, the lighting of the cauldron, because it was outside the stadium San Siro, it was in this location where there is this arch called Arco della Pace, which is a beautiful view with the castle in the back, and plus one in Cortina. So we had to lit the one next to the castle with the people in the San Siro stadium watching. So we recreate a human cauldron with a choreography that represent the same shape of the cauldron that open up simultaneously to the Cortina one and to the Arco della Pace one. So I think that was a good moment.
I mean, I said, you have to be universal to appeal to people around the world, but also you're, of course, showcasing Italy, Italian creativity, Italian values. You've got over 3 hours to do that. But is it hard nonetheless? You have to make a choice. You chose, Armani, for example, you chose poetry. Was it difficult to sort of narrow down what you were going to focus on to sort of represent Italy in this big global event?
No, it's not difficult. It's fun, actually. You get the privilege to make choices, and it's fun, and you take full responsibility for it. But overall, one thing that helps a lot, it's to be with a very fast pace. Every 3 minutes, 3-4 minutes, you have to change completely the scene. Something has happened new, and that helps a lot. That maybe you're not so sure about one act. You may like Mariah Carey or not, but then immediately afterwards there is, you may like a big confusion pop version of Italian design and culture, etc. But then before there was an impeccable executed ballet of La Scala, representing the myth of Amore Psiche and Canova. So in a way, you speak many languages with a very fast pace, so that then you kind of go through things.
Last question, very briefly. Obviously, the opening ceremony is done. It's been a great success. What's next for you? Do you move on to the next project straight away, or do you have a much-deserved holiday?
No, you need to digest a little bit and process what you've been through. Thank the people that really put long hours, long days under the rain, in the cold, to rehearse and to make this thing happen. And then you approach the new thing, which is the next biggest event in the world.
The next biggest event in the world. Marco Balic, creative lead of the Milano Cortina 2026 opening ceremony, speaking with Monocle's Ed Stalker. Check out the full Monocle in Milan episode on our website or wherever you get your podcasts, or tune in at 9 a.m. London time is when the next episode will be out tomorrow. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Angelica Jobson, our researcher was Annalise Maynard, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.